We're continuing our series, our Overwhelmed series, this morning. And I want to read just an excerpt from a book. It's called Fervent by Priscilla Shirer. And it's the opening words to a chapter. My wife read them to me this week. It's an opening words to a chapter called Pressure. Listen to what she says. She says, "If I were your enemy, I'd make everything seem urgent, as if it's all yours to handle. I'd bog down your calendar with so many expectations you couldn't tell the difference between what's important and what's not. Going and doing, guilty for ever saying no, trying to control it all, but just being controlled by it all instead." Those words sound familiar to you at all? You may not have read the book. You may never heard of the author, but it doesn't matter. Those words are familiar to you not because you've read them, but because you've experienced them. I mean, think about what she says. Everything seems urgent. You ever felt that way? Everything that's going on in our life, there is nothing. Everything is at a 10. I've got to get this done, and I've got to get this done. I've got to get this done. I've got to get this done. Or how about feeling like there's so many expectations you can't tell the difference between what's important and what's not? Going and doing, you ever felt guilty for saying no? Trying to control it all, but instead feeling like it's controlling you, your schedule, your calendar. So I think most of us can relate to those words because those words describe what it looks like, what it feels like to be overwhelmed. And the fact is that the majority of people in our world, that's their existence. They're living a life that's overwhelmed. But the problem that we're addressing here in this series isn't out there. It isn't with everybody in the world who's feeling overwhelmed. The problem that we're addressing is right here in this room. That many of us, in my conversations, in our meetings, many people, many of you, this is your existence. You're feeling overwhelmed. You're running and running and running, and yet you feel like you can't keep up. You're treading water, trying to keep your head above the water, and yet what you're doing is you feel like you're just going under. It feels like you're drowning. You've got this out-of-control schedule where you've got responsibilities and commitments and relationships and church and all the things that you feel like you're supposed to be doing, and it's this big rat's nest that you're trying to manage, and yet it feels like it's not manageable. It's just weighing you down. And the problem with that is this. I told you, every week I'm going to say two things to you. There's two things I'm going to keep reminding you of. And so I'm going to repeat myself. But the reason I'm repeating myself is because we have got to get this driven into our heads and our hearts. Number one, this is not what God wants for your life. This is not what God wants for your life. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, here's what you need to hear. God did not save you so you could survive. God did not save you so you could just get by. God didn't save you so that you could just hunker down and hold out until Jesus comes again. That's not what He saved you for. He didn't save you to live an overwhelmed life. Jesus saved you to be an overcomer. I'm going to read the passage to you again, 1 John chapter 5. Let me just read it. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God. And then verse 4, everyone who has been born of God, listen, overcomes the world. Is not overcome by the world, is not overwhelmed by the world. A person who has been born again, who's believed in Jesus Christ, has entrusted their life to Him. The writer, John, says, here's what that means. It means you've overcome the world. And when he's talking about the world, he is talking about the fallen system and culture of the world. And a part of that is being overwhelmed. A part of our fallen world is that sense of being overwhelmed that haunts us. It's part of living in a broken world, but it is not God's design for your life. It's a pattern. Remember Romans chapter 12, I read it the first week. Do not be conformed to the pattern of the world. One of the patterns of this world is living overwhelmed. We're not to live that way. Instead, we're to be transformed. There's a change that has to take place. So God's plan for your life, God does not want you to live this way. He doesn't want you to live overwhelmed. He wants you to be an overcomer. Which means, number two, the second thing I said I was going to remind you every week is that there is a way for you to have freedom in an overwhelmed world. You don't have to live this way. It's not only that God doesn't want you to live this way, but listen, you don't have to live this way. There is a way for you to be free, and that's what this series is all about. How do we find that freedom? And so each week we're answering two very simple questions. Number one, why are we overwhelmed? If God doesn't want you to be overwhelmed, and you don't have to live this way, then you've got to ask a question that requires you to look in the mirror. Why is it that I'm still overwhelmed if that's the case? And so we're trying to dig down deep. We're trying to get under the surface to do some heart work. Because it's not just a simple answer. It's not just, and we said this week one, it's not just because your schedule is full. We've got to go deeper than that. That's the surface. We've got to dig deep underneath, and we've got to do some self-examination. And the second question is, and what do we practically do about that? How do we see change happen? And so week one, we talked about the disconnected life. Part of the reason we as Christians get overwhelmed is because we are often living disconnected, functionally disconnected from God. Right? If you remember, we used the example of the Israelites in the wilderness. You remember when they were gathering manna? And God said, you need to collect, here's the food I'm providing for you. I'm not giving it to you, not giving it to you way in advance. What do you have to do? You have to go and gather it once a day. I'm providing everything that you need for this day, today, and tomorrow I'll provide everything that you need for that day, and that's the way it works. You've got to gather each day. And it's the same thing. God is giving us, He has made available to us every resource we need in order to be and do what He's called us to. He's made it available to us. But He doesn't give it to us in a one-time download. He calls us to live in that dependent, intimate, consistent relationship with Him. And so part of the reason lots of Christians are overwhelmed is because what they try to do is maybe twice a month come to church and get their tank filled up, and if we could just get enough, then I'll go muddle through the next week or two, and then I'll come back and try to get filled up again. And I tell you what, God loves you too much to let that work. Because God didn't save you to muddle through. God saved you to be an overcomer, and a part of that is having a relationship. He wants a relationship with you. One day at a time, one moment at a time. Last week we talked about the performance-driven life. Part of the reason we get overwhelmed is because we are driven by this need to get affirmed by the people around us. And what that means is it drives us to constantly live for the approval and affirmation of other people. Paul described it like living in a courtroom. You're always trying to get the verdict, trying to find your worth and value from the people around you. But when you're doing that, the verdict never comes in. It's never enough. I think of it like running on a treadmill. You're always running and running and running, but you're never getting anywhere. You're never gaining any ground. It's exhausting, isn't it? I mean, those of you who get stuck in that, you know how overwhelming it is. You know how exhausting it is. You're always trying to put your best foot forward. You're always trying to put on their performance, and you spend time around people, and you kind of get worn down because you're always trying to get that approval. But it's never enough. And so how do you get out of it? Well, you've got to go deep into the identity that you have through God's grace. Because the verdict is in from the only person who matters, truly. In Jesus Christ, the verdict is already in, because here's what God says about you. You are my child whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased. And if that verdict is in, then I don't have to run on the treadmill anymore. You can't make me or break me by your opinion. Your affirmation isn't going to make me, and neither is your criticism going to break me. Why? Because I have the affirmation of my Father who is in heaven. Right? If we're going to get out of, we're going to get out of the overwhelmed way of living. You got to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You've got to learn a new way of living. And this morning we're looking at something that I think it's going to be somewhat challenging for us. And I think it's quite interesting because I don't believe that most churches will address this particular issue, because I think most churches are a part of the problem in this one. Right? The issue that we're looking at, again, we're not talking about being overwhelmed out there in the world. We're talking about being overwhelmed here in the church. And the particular issue that we're looking at this morning, some churches actually encourage this dysfunction. And there's lots of churches who, at the least, they don't discourage it. Because we've bought into the lie as the church that the only way we can succeed is if we have enough people who will live overwhelmed. And what we've created, the issue that we're addressing, is what I've titled servaholics. And if you want to know what that looks like and you want to know how to get out of it, take a look at the passage we're going to be going through together this morning. It's verse 38, chapter 10 of Luke, through verse 42. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. But one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. This is God's word. Would you pray with me? Father, I pray right now in this moment that you would help us to be like Mary, that we would sit at your feet and listen. Lord, that we would not be distracted by many things, anxious and troubled, but that we would really be able to be present in this moment. God, you speak to us through your word, and so I'm praying that you help us to listen. And not just to hear it, but that we would respond to it, that you would show us ourselves in the areas that we need to address, and that we would be, God, we would be transformed and changed. We would learn a new way of living this morning. And God, I recognize that in this room there's many different stages of life and situations and circumstances, but I'm so thankful, God, that you can speak to everyone. And so, Lord, you speak. You teach us. Because all of us, including myself, God, we need to grow in this area. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. So, before we dig into the passage, I just want to ask a question, and I'm going to have you raise your hand if this is you. All right, you don't have to raise it. Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate the literal Dennis in this moment. Just before we dig in, just as a glance, you probably have heard this passage before. How many of you relate to Martha more than you relate to Mary? If you relate to Martha more than you do to, raise your hand high. I want to see it. Okay, okay. So look around the room. Look around the room. All right, you can put your hand back down. I'm one of those people. I can relate to Martha more than I can to Mary because I look at the situation and I look at Martha's response, and to me it makes sense, right? I mean, think about this. Jesus shows up at Martha's house. She welcomes him in, and what does she do? She gets to work. He shows up, she gets to work, cooking a meal, making something for him to eat. Why? Well, because that's who Martha is. Martha is a doer. She's a get things done kind of woman. She's a take control, no sitting around, no, she's not lazy. She doesn't have to be asked to get things done. She's the one who's going to see it. She sees a hole, she's going to fill it. She sees a problem, she's going to fix it. Martha is what you would call, in my mind, a leader. And I know there's lots of people in here who could relate to Martha who wouldn't necessarily call themselves a leader, but I want you to know, if you can relate to some of what Martha's experiencing this moment, my guess is it's because there's a portion of you, there's somewhere in you, that whether you want to own it or not, that you are a leader. And I know sometimes it feels like a curse. You see those problems and you go, I got to fix it. You see a hole and you're going, I've got to fill it. I know sometimes it feels like a curse. But what I want you to hear before we go through any further is that it's actually a great gift that you've been given. In fact, Paul in Romans chapter 12, when he's talking about the gifts that God's given to the church, he at one point in time, he says to the one who leads, lead with zeal. You know what that word zeal means? We read it a few moments ago in Isaiah chapter 9. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. There's a sense of passion. But listen, it's swiftness of movement or action, haste and speed. It's earnest commitment in the discharge of an obligation. Some other words, eagerness, earnestness, diligence, willingness. If you're to lead, Paul says, you got to do it with zeal, do it with passion. Don't be lazy, don't sit around, don't be the person that's got to be asked all the time. You are the person who needs to go. Because it's an amazing gift, and Paul's not contradicting Jesus here in this moment. As Jesus is confronting Martha, Paul isn't on the other side going, oh, well, actually, it's okay. No, but he's talking about the great gift that you've been given, because you've been given a gift that has the ability to do what other people aren't going to do, to help other people do what they couldn't do on their own. Right? A leader's the person who's going to say, okay, you're here, and you need to get over there, so let me show you the way. And that's a wonderful gift that you've been given. It really is. But there's a danger to it at the same time. And you know what the danger is? The danger is that as leaders, we become self-reliant over workers. Right? On the one hand, it's easy to become self-reliant. Why? Well, because as a leader, you're a trailblazer. And you're not necessarily the person who's looking for the people that you're going to rely on. Why? Because other people are relying on you and you're going, hey, let's go. Right? It's in essence, a big major picture of it is Moses in the Old Testament leading the people of Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land. Moses was a leader. And at the very beginning of the story, if you remember, Moses was, he was walking with the Lord, but at the same time, he was trying to get it all done on his own. Do you remember? At one point in time, his father-in-law has to come and say, hey, dummy, you're burning yourself and the people out by doing all of this on your own. That's not the way it's supposed to be done. So on the one hand, we can be self-reliant, and at the same time, because we're the doers, because we're the go-getters, because you're the person who sees a hole and you fill it, you see a problem and you fix it, you tend to take on more than you should. It's what Moses did. And in this situation, it's what Martha's done. It's what she's struggling with. And there's a specific place that we need to apply this morning, as I said. One of the mistakes that people have made in the past is taking this passage and going, okay, you know who this is about? This is about all the workaholics out there in the world. So all those people who go and they work, and they don't have any time to sit at Jesus' feet. And so to all the people in here who have jobs, who are out there working, overworking all the time, we got to talk to you and you got to learn how to sit at Jesus' feet. Don't get me wrong, that has to happen, but that's not what this passage is about. Martha isn't at her job. Martha's at her home. And what is she doing? She's serving Jesus. See, she's serving, doing a lot of good things, but what does Jesus say? At the end of the day, she thinks she's doing all of this stuff for Jesus in a way that's going to please him, but if you read the passage, is Jesus pleased? Is Jesus going, man, you're right, Martha, Mary is such a lazy bum. Goodness sake, I've been thinking it the whole time. I'm glad you came out and confronted me to tell her to get off her butt and get things done. No, Jesus doesn't affirm Martha. In this moment, he's affirming Mary, who is sitting at his feet. So here she is. She's doing, serving, doing all sorts of good. And Jesus' conclusion is, you're doing all of that stuff that you think is really good, but what have you done? You've missed the best thing. You've missed what's most important. And I know that the instant we say that, the first question you start asking is, well, what's the best thing? And I want to tell you, you probably already have made an assumption, and you're most likely at least partially wrong on it. I'm going to answer that question, but we're not going to answer it yet. We're going to get to it, but first of all, we've got to understand what Martha's problem is. You see, this is not a message to people out in the world who are being workaholics. This is a message to people who are serving Jesus, who are being servaholics. And here's how I've defined it. And again, this is not a technical term, of course. It's something that I've created, but I see it as a real problem. Here's my definition, and it needs work, but I'm going to give you what I've got. Here's how I define a servaholic. A servaholic is someone who is so addicted to serving that they often cannot say no, and usually take on more than they should, thus creating an overwhelmed life. A servaholic is someone who is so addicted to serving. Now, I know, here's what I think is probably happening. Some of your minds are going, I'm not addicted. How many addicted people say that very thing? That should challenge you in enough to go, oh, wait a minute. Do I have a blind spot here? You are so addicted to serving that you have a hard time saying no, and therefore you take on more than you should, thus creating an overwhelmed life. That is what Martha is experiencing this moment. She's serving. She's taken on more than she should, and she's overwhelmed. She is a servaholic, and the question is, are you? And let me give you a few symptoms. All right, let me give you some things to examine. As you look at Martha's life, what do we see as the symptoms of what's coming out of her life? All right, and then I'm going to give you some questions to ask yourself. And then we're going to talk about why, and we're going to talk about a cure. But here's the three symptoms I see. All right, symptom number 1 is inner turmoil. Symptom number 2 is outer trouble. And symptom number 3 is spiritual distraction. Right? When Jesus responds to Martha, look at verse 41. He says, "But the Lord answered, Martha, Martha, what are you? You are anxious and troubled about many things." Those two words mean he's not just repeating the same words, he's addressing two different problems. He says, number one, you're anxious. This is inner turmoil. The original word actually means to be torn apart on the inside by so many different responsibilities. Your heart is being pulled in so many directions, you're being pulled apart. A servaholic is someone who's serving, and you've committed yourself to so many different roles and responsibilities. You've said, yes, 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 problem, I'll fix it. Hole, I'll fill it. I'll get that done. And as a result, let me just ask you for a moment, are you experiencing inner turmoil because you're over-serving, and as a result, your heart is literally being pulled apart in all sorts of different directions? Symptom number 2 is outer trouble. It's outer trouble. Jesus says you are anxious and you are troubled. And what that trouble word means is that now your inner turmoil has bled out into your external world. And specifically, it's affecting your relationships. Listen, when you are serving so much that it negatively impacts your relationships, you've got a serving problem. And again, I know this is crazy because in the church we're always going, we need you to serve, we need you to serve, we need you to serve, right? I said the church is often part of the problem. We either encourage it or at the very least we don't discourage it. But when you are serving so much that it's negatively impacting your relationships, you have a servaholic problem. And there's 2 ways that I see that her relationships get negatively impacted. First of all, the people that she should be loving become the object of her annoyance and frustration. She's supposed to be serving Mary and Jesus in this. She's the one who decided to go cook the meal. So she's cooking it not just for Jesus, but for Mary. And probably Lazarus, because they share that house together, 2 sisters and a brother. So she's cooking, but she moves from loving them to now she's annoyed and frustrated with them. I mean, she's not loving them. I mean, look how she treats, let's just think about Mary for a moment. She walks into the room, and here's Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. She doesn't go over to Mary and say, Mary, listen, I know you're so excited that Jesus is here. I'm excited too, but listen, we got to cook a meal, and what I'd like you to do is come give me a hand so that we can come back out and both sit at Jesus' feet. Wouldn't that be wonderful? She comes out, and she basically, I can just see it this is the way I see it in my mind. She kind of puts her hand in Mary's face and goes, hey, Jesus, I don't know if you've realized, but I'm out slaving in the kitchen, and Mary's in here being selfish and lazy. And I might as well not say anything to her because she's not going to listen to me. So I would like you to intervene and get this done. Don't you care? So she's not loving Mary. And think about it. She's now looking at Jesus and she says, do you not care? Stop for a moment and think about this. Why is Jesus there? If you look at the first verse, now as they went, he's on a trip with the disciples. On their way, Jesus entered a village. So now he takes a little sidestep into a village on his own. It's not they all went. He went specifically to this village, not by accident. It's not like he showed up and was like, I don't know, where am I going to go? Oh, there's Martha, and she's invited me into her house. He goes to this village to meet with this family. Why? Because he cares. It's a family he loves. And by the way, let's just take it another level up. Why is Jesus here in this world at this moment? We just talked about him coming into the world, right? A child is born, a son is given. Why? Because he loves us and cares for us, and rather than leaving us in our sin, he comes to die, take our place, to live the life we couldn't, to die the death we deserved. Jesus, don't you even care? The people she's supposed to be loving have turned into the object of her annoyance and frustration. Have you ever had that happen? And not only that, she goes from serving them to now controlling them. She stops her service. She doesn't have she starts, I'm guessing, on the right foot, right? I'm gonna serve. I'm gonna make a great meal. But somewhere in the process, she loses her servant heart because now she's all about controlling people. She might as well have walked into the room and go, hi, my name is Martha, and I have a wonderful plan for Mary's life, and everybody needs to get on board. She not only knows what Mary's supposed to be doing, can you stop and just think, she knows what God's supposed to be doing. Jesus, how can you be teaching her and not intervening in this moment? You're obviously confused here because you're not aware of how hard I'm working in the kitchen. Because if you were aware, Jesus, wouldn't be letting Mary sit at your feet and just listen to your teaching. You'd be telling her to get off her butt and help me. You see, when you're serving so much, that the people that you're supposed to be, when you serve, you're supposed to be loving those people. You're supposed to be lifting them up. And when those people become the object of your annoyance and frustration because you are stretched so thin that you can't truly engage in loving them, or you go from serving to controlling, and now you're telling everybody, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. Do you know what's happened? You've got a problem. And here's the third symptom. Spiritual distraction. Spiritual distraction. You see, here's Martha, and she has been, what does it say? Look again. Verse 40, but Martha was distracted with much serving. Distracted from what? What was she distracted from? Jesus. She's too busy serving to spend time with Jesus. Let me tell you what, this is, and I'm going to be, I'm always honest, but I'm going to be transparent with you as much as I can this morning, is just to tell you, listen, there have been seasons in my life where this has been my story as a pastor. I'm doing and I'm doing and I'm doing and I'm doing, and I'm doing so much that I am not making any space in my life for truly having my own personal, intimate relationship with God. And I'm not alone. And that's not my story now. But I'm telling you, that story has been there. And here's what I've experienced. When that's your story, do you know what happens? You get burnt out. There is a problem, and it's an imbalance in your life. Jesus never calls you to serve in a way that is going to destroy you, your relationship with the people you're serving, and especially your relationship with Him. But there are so many people who replace being in a relationship with Jesus with doing for Jesus. Right? Do you spend time with the Lord? Do you ever sit at His feet and listen to His teaching? I mean, I'm talking you personally, not just that you show up on Sunday morning. I'm saying, do you have a relationship with Jesus outside of the time that you spend serving? I know people who have replaced relationship with serving. And don't get me wrong, serving should be a part of that relationship, but I want you to hear this. Your serving isn't meant to get you into relationship. It's meant to flow out of your relationship. And so if you are a servaholic, here's what you do. You're serving, and you've got no time for Jesus. You're spiritually distracted. Here's some questions that I would just encourage you to think about as you look in your own heart. And again, I'm trying to hold up the mirror for us. Does your serving ever lead to consistent inner turmoil and being overwhelmed? Do you feel guilty for saying no, and as a result, you say yes all the time? When you are serving, do you tend to play the victim or the suffering hero, living in self-pity because you have so much to do? When you are serving, do you tend to judge others as less because you don't see them serving as much? Does your serving lead to conflict in relationships, even acting in unloving ways or thinking of unloving thoughts towards those whom you are serving? Do you get easily irritated with others because you're serving so much? Are you impatient because other people don't get with your program? Is your being with Jesus often replaced with doing for Jesus? In other words, are you okay with skipping out on your daily relationship with Jesus and replacing it with doing lots of things to serve Jesus? Is it easy for you to relate to Martha's serving ethic and frustration with Mary's priorities? If you say yes to any of those things, then here's what I would challenge you to do, is to really get honest with yourself about a problem that maybe you've got, and part of the reason that you're overwhelmed. And if this is you, then you've got to start asking the question, well, why? Because if you're going to fix it, you've got to get to the root cause. Why is it that you can't say no? Why is it that you're always taking on more and more commitments and responsibilities? Why are you doing that? And I would say there's two layers to it. The first layer that Jesus addresses with Martha is this. When He answers and He says, let's read the last two verses again. He says, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion. Stop for a moment and think about this. Mary has chosen the good portion. What does that mean about Martha? Martha is overwhelmed by all of the serving that she's doing, not because Jesus asked her to do it, not because she had to do it. I want you to hear this. It's because she chose it. If you are a servaholic and you have spread yourself so thin, you have to recognize and own the cause. And at the surface, the surface cause is you've been choosing it. No one has asked you to do it. Listen, Jesus in this moment is saying, Martha, you need to understand, I don't burn my people out. Jesus is a good manager of his people and their time, and he is never going to ask you to serve in such a way that will destroy you, your relationships with other people, and especially your relationship with him. If it's happening, it's not because that's what he's asked you to do. It's because it's what you chose to do. And I don't say that to beat you up. I say we've got to own that, and then we've got to take a look deeper and go, okay, so but why? If I'm making that choice, if that's why I'm overwhelmed, then why do I do that? And look, I could spend hours talking about reasons that people make this, but I'm going to fly through a couple. You are the one who has to do the heart work. You are the one who has to do some self-examination, because if you're going to change it, you've got to get to the root. For some people, it's just they just lack an understanding of boundaries. They don't look at their life and see all of the responsibilities that God's given them and go, okay, I've got to do each of those really to the fullest ability that I can to honor God. And I've got to set boundaries so that I can do that. They don't do that. They just kind of go, well, I just say yes to everything. And as a result, they're doing nothing well. For some people, number two, it's because you're a people pleaser. You don't want to disappoint anyone, so you say yes to everything. You feel like I want people to like me. Right? So if somebody asks me to do something, I got to say yes, because otherwise they might not like me. Number three, for some people, it's pride. Do you know what pride looks like when it comes to this? You're the person who says, I am the only person who can do it as well as it should be. If I don't do it, it's all going to fall apart. People will mess it up. So I got to take ownership of this. For some people, it's avoidance. They serve so much because they want to avoid other issues in their lives. You got a problem in your marriage, you've got a problem with your family, you've got a problem with your finances, you've got a problem with a job, you've got a problem with a boss, and in order to avoid those problems and avoid those relationships and avoid dealing with those things, you take more and more responsibilities outside of those things so that you don't have to be around those things as much. For some people, it's a twisted understanding of how to please Jesus. I think that the more I do, the more Jesus is pleased with me, and Martha shows us just the opposite. And then for some people, it's bad theology. And here's what I mean by that. It's the theology that says the way that you get saved, the way that you get forgiven, the way that you get accepted is if I come to church enough and I put enough money in the offering plate, and if I do something. If I serve enough in church, God will love, forgive, and accept me. And so you're doing because you're hoping that you will be earning salvation. And that's bad theology. That's not the gospel. I'm sure there's a lot more, but the whole point is, you've got to dig under the surface and you've got to go, okay, so why? What is it that is driving me to be a servaholic? What is it that's driving me to say yes to everything? What is it that's driving me to not place boundaries in my life? Why is it that I am allowing myself to get put into situations, choosing situations, where I'm literally being pulled in so many directions that I can't do any of it well? And as a result, I'm overwhelmed and I treat people poorly, and I'm not investing in my relationship with God. You've got to ask those questions, and then here's the next step. Now we got to do something about it. And the question is, how do we change it? And here's my answer to you. You've got to find the best thing. You've got to stop doing all of the good things that you're doing and replace it with the best thing. Stop doing, now again, I don't know how many churches will tell you this. Because most churches, in my experience, are going, you've got to start doing, how many places are you serving? Because we need you to serve in more. Because we got all these holes and they got to get filled. Oh, you're already serving in 5 places? Well, there's this other place that's not going to compete with all the other things you're doing. Stop doing all of the good things that you're doing, and you need to replace it with the best thing. But here's the question. What is the best thing? Right? In this moment, Jesus says, well, Mary has chosen the best. Mary's chosen what is right. Look at it. Mary has chosen the good portion. She's chosen the best thing in this moment. Here you are, you're doing all of these good things, and you're thinking it's good, but Mary has chosen the good portion in this moment. You've got to replace all the serving and doing all of these other things with the good portion. But what is it? And what I challenged you with earlier is don't jump to conclusions, because here's what most people say. Most people say, here's the best thing. Here's what we should always be doing. I got to sit at the feet of Jesus with kind of the puppy dog eyes, and I just got to look up at him and listen to his teaching. We should just be sitting at the feet of Jesus. That's what he wants me to do all the time. Yes and no. You're partially right and you're partially wrong. Here's why I say that. In this moment, why was it the good portion? Here's why it was the good portion in this moment. Why did Jesus come over to Mary and Martha's house? Why did he come over to their house? I mean, it was intentional. It wasn't accidental. He showed up at their house for a reason. What did he come for? Did he come over for a big meal? No, he did not come over for a big meal. He came over to spend time with Mary and Martha. That's what he came over for. He came over to spend time with these two women that he loved and cared for. And Mary got it. She sat at his feet. She chose the good portion because that's what Jesus wanted them to do in that moment. If Jesus came over for a big meal, guess what Mary should have been doing? She should have been out cooking in the kitchen. But Jesus in that moment came over to spend time with them. So in that moment, the best thing was to spend time with Jesus, not go run out in the kitchen and make a gigantic meal. See, here's my answer for what the best thing is. The good portion is to do what Jesus wants you to do right now. It's not just sometimes, right now, what does Jesus want you to do? Here's what Jesus wants you to do right now. He wants you to sit at his feet and listen to his word. That's what he wants you to do right now. But after this, is he wanting you to just stay at his feet, just listening and not moving? When we get done with this service, here's what I'll tell you. There's things that he's going to want me to do. He's going to want me to love my wife, and he's going to want me to serve my children, and he's going to want, there are things that he wants me to do. And the challenge is this, to be so in tune with Jesus that I know what it is that he's calling me to do right now, and that's what I'm doing. See, Martha missed it. She had no idea because she was so distracted with all the serving that she chose to do that she missed what Jesus wanted her to do in that moment. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you understand? It's not just that, yes, you need the relationship. Yes, you need to sit at his feet. There are times where he wants us to be doing that. But there's also times where he's going to say, go and share the gospel. Go and preach the gospel to the world. I want you to go and care for that person over there who's sick and in need. There's times where he wants us to be moving. There's times where he wants us to be sitting. But the best thing, what he wants us to be doing is what he wants right now in this moment. Martha was so distracted she wasn't in that moment. And she missed what Jesus wanted from her right then and there. And see, some of us are running so much that we're trying to do all these good things, but we're so unaware of what Jesus actually wants because we're disconnected. We're unaware because we're too distracted. And so let me just give you 4 quick things. Practical. So what do we do? Number 1, you've got to be aware of context. Martha had to be aware of the context. She had to be in tune with what was going on right now, that Jesus came over to spend time with her in that moment. You've got to be aware of your context. And here's some of the context that I would encourage you to think about. What's the space that you have in your life? When you think about where the Lord wants you to serve, what's the space that is available? Because you have other responsibilities. The Lord will never call you to serve in such a way that your family isn't taken care of. The Lord will never call me to pastor in such a way that my wife is not loved. I'm too busy serving. I would love to spend time with you, but I've got responsibilities at church. The Lord will never call you to serve in a way that it will take away from the responsibilities that he's given you. What's the space? Number 2, what are the needs that you see? What are the things that God's presenting to you? You got to be aware of context. What's going on right here, right now? What is the bandwidth and the resources that you have in your life? In other words, do your gifts line up with the needs? Do you have the ability? If you say yes to that, will you be able to do it to the best of your ability to the glory of God? Or are you stretching yourself so thin in that instance that you won't do it well at all? You've got to be aware of context. Number two, you've got to sit at his feet. Mary is the example for us here in this moment. But I want you to hear, what does it mean to sit at his feet? If you go to the book of Acts, at one point in time, people are selling their property and they're bringing their money to the apostles so that it can be distributed to other people who have needs. Do you remember where they placed the money that they got from selling their property? They placed it at the feet of the apostles. You just place something at the feet of someone else is to say, this is no longer mine, it belongs to you. You have authority over this to use it as you see fit. To put yourself at the feet of Jesus is to say, my life is no longer my own. It is yours to use it as you will. And here's what that means. That means the first question that I'm asking is not, what do I feel like I should do? It's not, what does everybody else want me to do? Here's the first question. What does Jesus want me to do? And I'm going to ask him. I'm going to ask him. But then number three, do you know what else you need to do? She was sitting at his feet, right? If you look at it, but Mary, who was sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. Not only do you have to ask him, what do you want me to do? You have to actually listen. And I do think that we have a culture that struggles with listening. When Sarah and I first started dating, we had a listening problem. I had a listening problem, particularly when we would have disagreements. You know how it works. When you get in a disagreement and you're not listening because you're too busy thinking about what you're going to say next. You know how that works? I don't know if anybody else can relate to that at all. We had that problem. Do you know how you know when you've listened? And we had to train ourselves. I had to train myself to do this. You know that you've listened when you can say back to the other person what they just said to you. See, the Lord is always speaking, but I think we have a hard time with listening. I'll just tell you one story, and then I'm going to wrap it up. There was a pastor who talked about when he was younger what really got him into the Word. He had a teacher who said, at one point in time they were on a retreat, and she said, I want you to take 30 minutes, and I'm giving you one verse. You're going to just focus on this one verse for 30 minutes, and I want you to come up with 30 things that you learned from this one verse in 30 minutes. One thing. And he went away, and at first he's overwhelmed, and he's going, how in the world am I going to get 30 things from one verse in 30 minutes? And so he got started, he observed a few things, and he got done with it, and he got a few minutes in, and he goes, I think I've seen everything. But as he tells the story, as it got longer and longer, he started to see more and more and more, and suddenly it was like a door opened up, and he started to see all of these things in one verse that he'd never seen before. And at the end of it, he had 30 things, and this teacher got them all back together, and she said, okay, let's share together. What did God teach you from this one verse? And they're all talking, and they're all sharing, and they all found all of these things in this verse, and they're excited, and listen to what she says to them. Here's what she says. She said, how many of you got them in the first 5 minutes? Nobody raised their hand. How many of you got them in the first 10 minutes? Nobody raised their hand. How about you? How many of you got those 30 things in the first 15 minutes? Maybe one or two people raised their hands. She said, finally, you've listened. Your problem is you don't take time. You can't just run by your Bible for 5 minutes in the morning for inspiration. That's not sitting at his feet and listening. That's a selfish approach. That's an emotional approach. That's not listening. See, if we're going to serve in the right way, it has to be driven by him. It has to be our lives surrendered to him. It has to be as he leads and we follow. And too many of us are trying to lead and asking him to follow. And as a result, we're doing all of these things that we really shouldn't be doing and missing out what he wants us to be doing right now. Listen, here is my promise to you. Look, at the end of the day, if you ask those questions, there's change most likely that's going to happen. Some of us, it's going to mean getting off our butts and getting in. Some of us are sitting, and the reason, listen, it's possible to get overwhelmed by serving too much. I believe it's true on the other side. It's possible to be overwhelmed because you're not doing anything. God's given you gifts to engage and use, and you're overwhelmed because you're not walking in obedience with him. For some of us, though, it's going to mean you're going to have to start limiting things. You're going to have to make some adjustments and changes. But here's the promises I'm going to make to you. And they're not my promises, they're God's promises. If you will do these things, number one, you won't be overwhelmed. You won't. You will actually find freedom. It doesn't mean you won't be serving, but you won't be overwhelmed. Number two, in the midst of your serving, you will find peace and joy where you don't have any right now. Some of you, you don't have peace and joy in your serving. You will find it. And number 3, get this. When everybody's doing what I just said, we as a church will be able to do everything that God wants us to do without anyone getting burned out. God provides every gift and every person needed to do everything He wants us to do in the time that He wants us to do it. That's what I want for our church. That's what I want for you. And the question is that what you want?